today I'm going to talk to you about £10 Pom, written by Carol Wilkinson, which I illustrated a couple of years ago. This is an amazing story, Carol's own family story about when she was a little girl and she and her mum and dad and brother journeyed all the way from England to Australia as migrants. And funnily enough, many years later, that's the same thing that I did. Because as you can tell from my voice, I was born in England too. So £10 Pom, written by Carol Wilkinson. This is a long book, it's got lots of text in it. So what I'm going to do for you today is I'm going to read the first page and then just talk a little bit about the story and the illustrations, and then finish off with the last page. And then I'm going to do some workshops with you showing some of the techniques of drawing and making the illustrations for this book. So here we go. I don't want to go to Australia. I've just started grammar school. My best friend Sally goes there too, and we're learning Latin and French. 2 weeks ago, my family and I put on our best clothes and caught a train to Birmingham, where a man asked us questions to make sure we'll be good migrants. Dad was nervous and Mum answered most of the questions. I was hoping she'd get the answers wrong, but I could see what the man wrote down on our application. Quite a nice family. Dad had always wanted to live in Australia, ever since he was a boy. When he married Mum, she didn't want to emigrate and leave her family. Then in 1962 there was something called the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it looked like there could be another world war, only this time it would involve nuclear bombs. Dad was finally convinced Mum to go to Australia. I have a collection of cards about Australia that came in tea packets. In Australia there are artesian wells, corroborees and coolibah trees. There are spiny anteaters, black swans and sharks. So the story goes on to describe how the family got ready to pack their stuff up and leave the country for good. They had to pack away all their things and take a ship across the world. This is really interesting that I was chosen to illustrate this book, because as soon as I read the manuscript I realised this was the same story that I went through, but many years later. My husband and I didn't travel by ship, we went by plane, but Carol and her family, they went through the same process. They said goodbye to their families and friends, and for them they thought they would probably never see them again, and they went down to Tilbury docks and they got on the biggest ship they'd ever seen in their life. It was actually a cruise ship that had been requisitioned by the government to transport migrants all the way around the world. And back in those days, it took 5 weeks to journey that far. So actually, if you think about it, it was not that long after the war and rationing had only just stopped. They had the holiday of a lifetime on this ship. It was big, it had play areas, it had food, maybe up to 5 meals a day. And for Carol and her friend that she met on the ship, there was dancing, there were discos and music and new people to meet. They had to refuel and take on food and supplies in various different ports. So as they sailed around the world, Carol and her family got the chance to get off the boat and take a look around the cities where they moored. They went to Naples and they went to Aden and various other places. Whilst they were on the boat during the day, there were lots of games and recreations and pastimes for the families to take part in. There were swimming pools and there were all sorts of sports that you could do on deck. And Carol got to know another young girl, Jennifer, who told her of her story of her parents having migrated once before and then not liking it and going all the way back to England and then coming out a second time. Travelling across the equator was a big thing for the families because they obviously never travelled anywhere near so far before, and they had a ceremony called the Crossing of the Line where they all dressed up. Eventually they arrived in Fremantle, the first port in Australia where the ship docked. And the sea was so rough just as they came in that after all that time of travelling, that was when Carol was really sick. When they got to Adelaide, they met up with their cousins, who they stayed with for quite a while. And in my illustrations, I show how packed that little house must have been in, with 2 families sharing everything. But eventually they got their own home, and once they moved in, they'd been there a few weeks, maybe months, and you get your crate full of all your possessions turns up at the front door, and you feel all the love pouring out as you can set up home properly in Australia. So I'm just going to finish by reading the last page. In England, my pocket money was 2 shillings and 6pence each week. Now I get 10 shillings. I have my own room again. I walk to the beach with my cousin Ivan, who walks all the way there without any shoes. I collect pretty shells and sea urchins. Perhaps living in Australia won't be that bad. And for the end papers for this book, those are all of Carol's family's possessions that got packed up into their trunk and transported around the world. And you know, I love drawing maps, so the opening page of this picture book is a map of the whole world, and if you can see, the little red dots are all the cities mentioned in the book. So they start out in Sheffield and Derby, where they live, and then they travel to Tilbury, and then the boat goes all the way round the Atlantic Ocean, through the Mediterranean, stopping off at Gibraltar, Naples and Port Said, and then down the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, stopping at Aden, across the Indian Ocean, stopping at Colombo, and then all the way across the Indian Ocean, finally coming to Fremantle and Perth. And then Carol's family continued on to Adelaide, where they made their home. Now, this is a non-fiction book, so there's stuff all about the migration scheme. So that's why it's called £10 POM, because back in those days you could travel all the way around the world to migrate, to come and settle in Australia for just £10 British per, I think it was per family. So there's all these facts here, and then on the following page you've got information about the ship they sailed on, the Arcadia. So lots of information about that. And then some of the terms that Carol and her brother and her family would have been trying to get used to. So some of the expressions of things they learned about Australia, and then some of the phrases that you might not be familiar with language that was used in England at the time. That's in the glossary. And then if you turn to the very back of the page, remember me saying I like to hide things in odd places in the book, like on the end papers? Well, here at the very back on the index page, I wanted somehow to fit in this illustrated letter. So I was imagining that Carol might be writing home to that friend she mentions right at the beginning, and instead of writing all of her airmail letter, she might want to draw some pictures of some of the adventures that she had on those first few months when she was getting used to living in Australia, with all the creatures that were so very different to the ones back home. For £10 POM, we're going to do some painting. Can you remember in the book how at the beginning Carol and her family were in England, and it was drab and it was dark and it was cold? As they travelled down to Tilbury docks, I used lots of greys and browns in my painting. And then as they journeyed around, there's them at the docks waiting to get on the ship, and as they journeyed around the world on the Arcadia, the colours became lighter and brighter and the weather became hotter and hotter, until eventually Carol and her family arrived in Australia, and this was when she was just settling down in her new home. And that's the beach, a little bit like Newcastle here, with bright yellows and greens and blues and a lovely sunshiny feel. So there are different ways that we can paint the sea. And so this is the dull English Channel Sea. I'm going to do a bit of painting today, and this is great kind of painting because it doesn't need any drawing skills. And look, I'm using a big scrubby paintbrush. This is about moving paint around and having fun with colour, not lots of fine details. So let's see what we can do. So painting the background scenes for £10 POM, quite often I use cardboard instead of white paper, because it gives you the texture and the background colour of the cardboard, which is really handy if you're painting a dull English scene. So for this I've just got some really rough paint brushes, and also I'm going to be using a plastic fork. So I've selected my dull colours. I'm going to actually make 2 paintings. I have got a palette here, but you know, for this I'm not really going to use the palette very much. I'm going to mix on the board. So I've got some drab green and some black, and it kind of helps when you're painting something. I also need some white because that's far too dark, and this is a little bit off-white. So in fact I'm going to put that on the palette. Let's put the palette a bit closer to me. There we go. And I'm going to use a different brush for the white so it doesn't get too mixed up. And I'm just going to start by putting a few dabs here and there and here and there. Yeah, I kind of find it helps when I'm drawing or painting anything if I make the sounds of it. So I might kind of go make crashy sea noises. Oh, don't put the black brush in the white paint. No, don't do that. Maybe on the distance it gets a little bit lighter out to sea. I've just got the colours in, and now, see that plastic fork? I'm going to make the waves. Here they go. Here's the dull drab. There's a lot of green in this. I'm using acrylic paint for this because it's really thick. It's got a lot of what they call body to it. Probably a very good idea if you put some newspaper or a cloth of some sort down on your surface before you start getting the paints out. Maybe a little bit of blue, but have you noticed I'm not really using much blue in this? You look at the sea at different weathers, then when it's cloudy, the water of the sea tends to reflect the darkness of the clouds rather than what we think of as blue of the water. Look at that angry rough sea we've got going on there. Put those down here, and oh, look at that. You see, there's lots of happy accidents you can have with it. You can actually paint with the fork and make loads of things happen. But by itself it doesn't really mean anything, does it? It's just an angry sea. So somewhere in there I've got to put a boat, and I'm using just a little bit of drawing to put in the Arcadia as it, now you can't really see it at the moment, so I don't have a finer paintbrush. What I'm going to do is I'm going to smooth some of the sea behind it a little bit and then rough it up a bit more, and then I'm going to use, this is a water soluble pencil so it should blend in, and there's the, see the pencil, like the fork, moves the paint around, and you can get all sorts of techniques, like all sorts of patterns. And here's the smoke coming out of the chimney because it was a steamship that she travelled around the world on. Every now and then you might want to wipe some of the paint off your pencil end. These are the portholes. There we go, and there's the mast. Sometimes these cruise ships, they have lovely fancy fairy lights from the mast. So I can keep adding to this. I could let it dry and then maybe work into it with a few more subtle marks. Maybe get a smaller paintbrush and make a few. I could even draw, like, what would you have in the ocean? You might have some porpoises or some whales coming up, maybe following the ship as it goes across the seas. And in the distance, maybe somewhere, just the land, you might be able to see the edge of the land somewhere in the distance, or maybe right up here, wouldn't it be? Maybe this is the land, and that up there isn't the sea, that up there is the sky. Now, when she got to Australia, things were very, very different. So a completely different kind of sea in Australia, where she lived down in near Adelaide with her family, her cousins. So it's a bright sunny day. So can you see on this side of the cardboard, I've actually put some paint down first. This was like a silvery white colour, just to brighten it up, because in the English side I wanted it to be as drab as possible, This side, I want it to be bright and sunny and blue, that lovely green blue colour that you get when you look out to sea here. So bright blue sunny sky with just, this is a lovely colour, this one here, it's called Australian Sky Blue. How lovely is that? It squirts out the brush and you can play around with it. You can just hear the seagulls, can't you, with this blue sky? I can hear them. I can also see them. There they are. Here are the seagulls. Okay, now here's the top of the sea. I need a dark colour for the background. There we go. Ugh, splop. And something much darker. Usually I have what you call an indigo blue, which is like, it's not black, but it's really, really dark blue. And it's great for adding dark areas like the horizon. You know, you look out to sea and it's much, much darker than we're near to. So I'm just putting a few, I've got too much of this bright blue. Need to get rid of that. And use this one here. What's this one called? Cobalt Turquoise Light. Let's have a go at this one. Squirt some. Oh, that is a gorgeous colour. Absolutely lovely. And it's pretty old. That's why it's a little stiff in the tube. There we go. Let's get that one out. And maybe a clean paintbrush and smudge these. Doesn't want to. It's far too old. It needs a bit of water with it. Oh, and what a good technique just doing this. The great thing about painting is you can just explore techniques to your heart's content. What it needs is some spray. Now I can use, what did I do with my fork? I can kind of flick bits of, oh, that's kind of fun, isn't it? Flick bits of white for the spray. Sometimes I use a different paint as well. This is called gouache paint and it acts slightly differently. You see it blends into it and makes a pattern all of its own. And you see all those little techniques there? I think it kind of, the two different materials don't like each other very much and they're all splurging around, making lovely patterns. And then of course, it's really set off an Australian sea with a lovely yellow sandy beach. And see that goldy silver colour underneath? If I let some of that show through, then they could be the shadows of footprints of where people walked along the beach. Oh, we could draw in some seaweed, some rocks. And we've got two very, very different seas there, haven't we? So there we go. I've made two completely contrasting sea scenes. One of drab, dark, grey, cold English Channel in the Northern Hemisphere using blacks and greys and greens rather than blues. And a contrasting scene with yellows and whites and greens, but a more turquoisey green, and this lovely creamy, and my favourite one, what is it? Australian sky blue in the sky. And just for this, I painted with a really thick, rubbishy old paintbrush, because I just wanted to splodge, move the paint around rather than painting delicate details, and a plastic fork. So hopefully you can find materials like these at home and have a go yourselves.